Okay, welcome to week 11 of our 13 to 1. It's not going to be 13 to 1. It's going to be about 21 to 1 at this rate. Um, so we're still on Elizabethan England, and we're actually going to be on this incredibly complicated area of religion. And like all these things, it's not massively interesting. It's actually quite difficult. But like all these things that are difficult, we're going to spend a little bit more time on it. So, as I said, if you want to have a go doing this question here, so religion was her main problem, blah de blah. So, you probably need to watch the previous video and this one to try and answer that question. So, this is a big question, and we'll see where we go with this. So, don't want to turn this into an RE lesson, but you know this really. So, the three religions around at this time. So, the old religion of Catholic faith was predominantly strong in North and West England. So, their basic beliefs: the Pope was head of the Church could forgive sin, the seven sacraments that you probably looked at in RE last year, and the belief that the bread and wine actually, becomes the body and blood of Christ during Mass. Their services were in Latin. The priests wore very expensive vestments, those special clothings you can see there, and churches had gold crosses and were highly decorated, etc. So, without going into the history of this, obviously Martin Luther protested against, the money being spent on the church and everything else, so against that. But really, the Protestant faith was strongest in southeast England, and the differences were that the monarch is head of the church. Only God can forgive sin, and they only believed in two sacraments, which is basically baptism and the Holy Communion. Services were in English. Priests would wear simple vestments, and churches were much more simple. Like the wooden pews you're kind of used to when you went to church at primary school. Kind of an extreme version of Protestants, or people called Puritans, and they were particularly strong in London and East Anglia. So they didn't believe in any popes, any bishops. So very similar beliefs to Protestants. God can forgive sin and the two sacraments. But basically a much purer and much plainer version of the Protestant faith. So, probably one of the most important slides and incredibly likely to come up in the exam is the religious settlement. So, really, for Elizabeth, like that picture on the right there, she wanted to get a balancing act here between pleasing Catholics and pleasing Protestants. So, in simple terms, the religious settlement tried to bring both of those faiths together to some kind of compromise. So, really, there was 5 sections to this. So first of all, the Act of Uniformity. So really, this brought together, as the word says, in a uniform manner. So churches looked the same, priests dressed the same, etc., etc. Also, the Act of Supremacy. So the recognition that Elizabeth was head of the church. They also introduced some injunctions, which I'll talk about in a sec. It also brought together a Book of Common Prayer that was in English. And they also established, I haven't actually fitted that word on there, I can't even say it either, ecclesiastical high commission. So basically their job was to go around and kind of inspect and make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. So really this was a compromise by Elizabeth to try and bring two sides with completely different views together. And generally, in the main, it was quite successful. So some of the things of the royal injunctions were that they had to teach the royal supremacy, within church. So basically, the Queen was the head of the church. Those who refused to attend church were fined and reported. English Bibles were printed and produced, and they got rid of pilgrimages to please Protestants, but they also allowed vestments to please Catholics. So there's a bit of a balance here between trying to please both sides. So, for example, as it looks in the middle there, so in order to please Catholics, they allowed candles and crosses in churches. In order to please Protestants, they got rid of pilgrimages. So the impact of this was the majority of the clergy accepted the changes. Only the Marian bishops, so basically their bishops appointed by Queen Mary, that's why they're called Marian bishops, they wouldn't accept this and were replaced. And pretty much most people accepted it and kind of moved on. So in most ways, this was pretty successful. So, what is the role of the Church of England? This is probably the most boring slide I've ever made. Basically, their role within society was to kind of reinforce the message from the government. They also had a role to instill law and order through church courts. Obviously, they provided church services like weddings and baptisms, etc., providing guidance and advice. And they were funded by taxes. These were called tithes, which was 10% of people's salary and income. In towns and cities, obviously, there was a much wider range of religious beliefs: Puritans, Protestants, Catholics, all kinds of different people. And like the churches today, it's still involved with dealing with issues of poverty. So, even though she did the religious settlement, and obviously the majority of people were relatively happy with that, there were two groups of people who still were a threat and a challenge to Elizabeth. So the first group were Puritans. So who were they? Well, as I just said, they believed in a pure church, i.e. they didn't want a church controlled by the Queen. They wanted to ban sinful activities such as gambling, and they wanted churches to be as simple as possible. And pretty much they detested everything about the Catholic Church and what they perceived to be were very indulgent and extravagant services. So, in particular, why were they a challenge to Elizabeth? There's two areas there. So, crucifixes. So, Elizabeth wanted to retain crucifixes within churches because, obviously, to please Catholics, but a lot of Puritan bishops threatened to resign, so she had to give way on this particular issue. Also, as you can see from the picture, they believed in very simple and plain clothes, and they refused to attend church or wear any special clothing around this issue. So to you and me, these things are just like, why do they care? But obviously to them, this was really important. So why were they a problem? So even though they were a small, community, they're incredibly vocal. A lot of eloquent speakers, and because they attacked Catholics, people began to talk about them and quite newsworthy. And also they were active in obviously the main power base in the UK of London. So Catholics, why were they a threat? Well, predominantly because of something called the Counter-Reformation. So what that was about was the Catholic Church trying to push back about the Protestant Reformation that was going on around Europe. And so they declared that all Protestants were heretics, and often they were executed by the Spanish Inquisition and things like that, tortured, very Christian. And the Pope himself instructed Catholics in England not to attend churches. So pretty much gave the green card to Catholics to say, hey, don't do it. And obviously, if you're a Catholic, you listen to the Pope. And this presented a big challenge to Queen Elizabeth, purely because a lot of the nobility were Catholic and about a third refused to attend church. They were called recusants, and it led to the revolt of the Northern Earls, which we'll look at next time. So why was this a problem to Elizabeth? Well, Catholic nobility traditionally were very rich and powerful. Over the years, have been given lots of favours and land by previous Catholic monarchs, particularly Mary, and they resented the new power that Protestant lords had. And also, the Pope pretty much gave them a blank check to rebel and not do what Elizabeth said. So we're going to look next time at some of the major threats that the Catholics produced. Also, purely geographically, England was surrounded by Catholic countries in Europe. So our nearest neighbour, the French. So Elizabeth, probably unwisely, had backed some French Protestants who were hoping to overthrow the French king, and in exchange England would get Calais back, but they failed, and this obviously angered the French. The Pope famously excommunicated Elizabeth and effectively tried to encourage both the French and the Spanish kings to openly attack England and turn England back into a Catholic country. So the biggest problem or threat to England was probably Spain, and there's a number of issues that was going on here. So England had harboured some Dutch rebels who were unhappy about the Spanish controlling their country, the Spanish Netherlands as it was known then. So this group of Dutch rebels were known as the Sea Beggars. So basically they were harbouring in safety in England and then going off and sailing and attacking Spanish ships in the English Channel. This obviously upset the Spanish. And also in a famous incident, there was a big storm and some Spanish ships took shelter in English ports. They also, just by chance, were carrying a huge amount of Spanish gold, which the English, or Elizabeth, decided to effectively steal and take this gold. So this was called the can't say that word again, Genovese loan, and again angered the Spanish king. Spain obviously based troops in the Netherlands to kind of subdue the Dutch. Obviously, the Netherlands again is just over the English Channel from England, so this kind of unsettled Elizabeth. And Mary Queen of Scots encouraged the Spanish to plot, so to give money, try and put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne, which we're going to look at next time. This whole area of religion is, I think, quite difficult to get your head around and quite difficult to understand about why it was so important. But if you want to have a go doing this question, I think it's a difficult question to be, but it's a good question to do because it makes you and forces you to go back and have a look at this video and the previous one. So next time we're going to look at Mary Queen of Scots and all the various revolts that she inspired until her execution.